All right, good afternoon, everyone. This is a two-part presentation, so we're going to go through the first part now for about 50 minutes, and then we'll take a 10-minute break and move into the second half. Um, and there'll be another 50 minutes. So if you have any questions, feel free to type them into the app under the questions section, and I'll keep an eye on that and see if there's any questions and make sure I answer those before we finish today. Okay, so what we're talking about today is sexuality and addiction. And let me get there's a little disclaimer just that I don't have any financial relationship with a commercial interest here with any product or anything like that in the scope of this activity. Okay, so some of our objectives today is really to talk about an overview of how addiction impacts human sexuality, which includes intimate relationships, gender identity and expression, LGBTQ+, and sexual functioning. So we're going to touch on all of those throughout the presentation. Um, so overall, the plan is to talk through and illustrate the range of human sexual beliefs and behaviors. So we're going to talk about kind of development, sexuality development, and gender development. And then also gaining an understanding of addiction's impact on shaping and defining human sexuality. And then lastly, to stimulate consideration of the applicability of human sexual development theory and concepts in the treatment of addiction. So to start out, let's talk about a definition of sexuality. I think the thing that's really important is to think about sexuality as an umbrella term, that this is, there are lots of layers to sexuality and there are a lot of components to sexuality. So looking at this definition, I think it's pretty good. It says that sexuality is one of the fundamental drives behind everyone's feelings, thoughts, and behaviors. It defines the means of biological reproduction, describes psychological and sociological representations of self, and orients a person's attraction to others. Further, it shapes the brain and body to be pleasure seeking. So there's several components or factors associated with sexuality. Number one is sex, two, gender identities, three, orientation, four, pleasure, then intimacy, expression, and reproduction. So there's a lot involved in sexuality, and it's not just, and that's why I say it's more of an umbrella term, because we could spend 2 hours talking about any one of these things individually, any one of these components or factors. So this presentation over the next 2 hours really is designed to be kind of a general overview. So we're not going to get into any one thing in a whole lot of depth, but to give you an overview of all these pieces and how sexuality really integrates and influences addiction and addiction treatment. And what does this mean for addiction treatment? How do we work with somebody? Um, and and if somebody presents to us with an addiction at any point in time in their lifespan, what are the kinds of things we need to think about from a sexuality perspective and how that is going to interplay with the addiction? So let's start diving in. Okay, so first we're going to talk about some language and some definition of terms. So you've probably heard some version of LGBTQIA plus or LGBT or LGBTQ plus. There's kind of several iterations of that at this point. So there's a combination of in these letters, there's a combination of sexual orientation and gender and people that might be supportive of this group of this community in general. So let's take it letter by letter. And I'm going to use the LGBTQIA, although there may be other letters recognized at this point. So this isn't an exhaustive list, but and it's kind of an ever-changing and evolving set of letters. But these are kind of what you might hear most, I think, or might be very common. So first is lesbian, which is related to sexual orientation or attraction. So a lesbian is someone of that identifies as female that is in a relationship or attracted to another female. Kind of on the other end of that spectrum is gay, which gay is somewhat of an umbrella term. It's typically associated with homosexual men. However, maybe more of an umbrella term for people who are attracted to the same sex in general. But it's often used, and how I'll use it today mostly is it's homosexual men. So again, that sexual orientation piece. Bisexual, bi meaning two, sexual also is a sexual orientation piece that someone is attracted to both male and female. So that bi part means both from a binary viewpoint of gender, both male and female. Transgender is where we kind of make the shift to looking at gender, not just sexual orientation. So someone who identifies as transgender is often transitioning from one gender to another. Typically, it is male to female or female to male. And so they may be kind of anywhere at any point in their transition. They could be kind of living as and dressing and presenting themselves from an expression standpoint as a different gender than what they were assigned at birth. Could also be that they've started taking hormones or have started to go through medical procedures to make that transition from one gender to another. But really, it's kind of an umbrella term that anyone identifying as transgender, meaning they're moving from one gender to another, um, it's kind of an umbrella term for anyone along that continuum there. Queer is typically someone that doesn't necessarily, again, could be a gender term, could also be somewhat of a sexual orientation term. So it's kind of used a little bit interchangeably in those regards. But queer is someone who may not identify with the binary concepts of gender, so may not identify as male or female, but might be somewhere in the middle or some combination of those binary genders, or could be kind of something different than the binary genders of male and female. Um, Sometimes it's also used in language as someone who identifies as queer may also be gay or lesbian, or kind of some other terms that have come around kind of more recently, I would say, where they may identify as being attracted to a person rather than a gender, a particular gender. So they may say, I'm attracted to who I'm attracted to versus I'm attracted to men or I'm attracted to women, or those kinds of things. Intersex is more of a gender term where a person may have particularly genitalia, chromosomes, or hormones that are somewhere in the middle between what we would traditionally think of as the binary genders of male and female. So, for example, someone who's intersex may have some genitalia of both what we would traditionally think of as male and female genitalia. Um, so again, there's an element of a combination between the two binary genders that we typically think of male and female. And then ally is the A in the LGBTQIA. And ally means it's just a person that is supportive and an ally of this community of people. So more of an umbrella term, but an ally means that somebody that is not necessarily in or doesn't necessarily identify as a person in any of these other categories or in this community, but is a supporter of this community of people. So not necessarily in the community, but supportive of the community. Okay, so let's go through some other terminology that may be helpful in conceptualizing some of these concepts that we're going to go through as it relates to sexuality and addiction. So gender assigned at birth, or sex assigned at birth, is basically when you think about when a baby's born and the doctor who delivers the baby says something like, "Ah, it's a boy." That's because they're seeing the genitals of the baby and saying, "Oh, it's a boy," or "Oh, it's a girl," same thing. So it's basically the assumption of somebody's gender based on their genitals and what's observed, by the doctor when a baby is born. So typically those are binary concepts of either male or female. And that's the second term on this slide, gender binary. So when I say that's traditionally the binary view or gender binary, it means male and female, and that there's really no other options according to a binary, gender being binary, that it's just male or female, and those are the options. We already talked about transgender, but just kind of to give you another definition or another spin on it, that gender identity is different from the one that they were assigned at birth. So for example, somebody who was assigned male at birth and transitions to female, they would be considered transgender, or vice versa. So basically that they're identifying as a different gender from the one that they were assigned at birth. Two-spirit is a term that's been around for centuries. It's a more indigenous term used with more indigenous or Native American populations. This has been around for quite some time, kind of all across the world. But basically, it's a term used to describe someone who walks between genders. So again, from this idea that gender was binary of male and female, that two-spirit means someone who's between those genders, and maybe is a combination of both genders, or something a little different, maybe a third gender, or is just kind of somewhere in the middle. That's kind of the best definition, but that they're in between genders, so they don't identify as male or female, but somewhere in the middle. Cisgender is a term that means that someone's identified gender matches what they were assigned at birth. So if I was assigned female at birth and I identify as a female, then I would be a cisgender or a cis female. If I was assigned male at birth and I identify as male, then I would be cisgender male or cis male. Gender queer is someone who's neither male or female, that they are between or beyond gender, or there is some combination of genders. So this is kind of a little bit of an umbrella term because it's somebody who doesn't identify as male or female from the binary standpoint, but so that person could be between genders, kind of like the two-spirit, or beyond genders, meaning that they don't identify with a gender period, that or they could be kind of a combination of genders. So again, a little bit of an umbrella term with that one. Non-binary just means that someone does not identify in the traditional binary concepts of male or female, or man or woman. So they don't identify with those binary concepts. So again, a little bit of an umbrella term here where it's a little bit of an abstract idea in terms of, what we like to put in our minds in terms of a gender, like someone is this or someone is that. We, kind of part of being humans, we want to put things in a category, or we want to label things to help us understand them. So this concept is that a person is identifying as not binary, meaning they don't identify as a male or female, but there's not necessarily an identification of what they do identify that might be different than that. So it just means that they don't identify as male or female. So they'd be non binary. Excuse me. The next term is gender fluid, which means that it's kind of the idea of gender being on a continuum and that somebody has elements or components of each gender in terms of the binary concept of gender, like characteristics or expressions related to male and female. So there might be a combination, or they might kind of flow back and forth, or somewhere in the middle, or they can express multiple genders at the same time. And we'll talk more about that as we go forward. So it just means that their gender is more fluid. They don't necessarily identify in one particular category, but they're kind of in between. And again, another term, a little bit of an umbrella term, of someone that can kind of fluctuate between genders. And then gender neutral is very similar to non-binary in that they don't identify as either male or female, but that they're just kind of neutral. So again, this could mean that somebody is, has elements or components of male and female, or, other genders. But really, when we talk about the term gender neutral, that means that they just don't identify in any particular category, that their gender is neutral, and not bound by the binary concepts of male or female. So this is not an exhaustive list of terms. There's lots and lots of terms out there, and they're kind of ever evolving as we continue to learn more about gender and how gender, the definition of gender and what gender means, continues to evolve. So we'll be talking more and more about this, and these terms may evolve over time, and probably will evolve over time as we continue to move through this idea of gender. Okay, so let's shift over to the theory of human sexuality development across the lifespan. And we'll probably stay here for the rest of this first part. And then we'll kind of talk about more of the treatment implications and the addiction piece. We'll get into some of that here, but we'll get into that more heavily. What are the implications for addiction treatment based on sexuality, and how those two interplay in the work that we do with clients that might struggle with addiction. So these developmental stages were adapted from Beyond the Basics, a source book on sexuality and reproductive health education published by the Canadian Federation for Sexual Health. So just keep that in mind. Okay, so we're going to go through the lifespan here and talk about sexuality and the development of sexuality. And then we're also going to interplay how addiction might impact people throughout these different phases of life. So first, let's look at early childhood sexuality, and this is birth to 3 years. So the little ones, the teeny tiny ones, from when they're first born up to the age of 3. And when you think about kids in this developmental stage, they're like little sponges. They just absorb lots and lots of information and learn so much. Think about language development and motor skills development, and how kids learn to, kind of crawl, then walk, and then run, and mobility and that kind of thing. So in this stage, from a sexuality perspective, kids are learning about love and trust through touching and holding. So you think of a little infant, they're being cradled and cuddled quite a bit. There's a sucking element. Kids like to put things in their mouths to kind of get a sense of what this is. There's a kind of an oral piece there. There might be some spontaneous reflective responses regarding erections or vaginal lubrication, but it's not necessarily, it's just sort of random and just the body function, not necessarily from any kind of stimulation. It's just sort of a reflexive response for the body as the body develops. Gender identity here is starting to develop. Kids know their gender identity regardless of their assigned sex at birth. And so we might see from a very young age kids experimenting with, things around gender, but they also may be learning things about gender from their family of origin or whoever their caretakers are. So, for example, adults might say to kids, oh, little boys play with this kind of toy, or little girls do this or do that, where there's some messages being received about gender identity. And there may be some gender role conditioning processes at play, that boys and girls are treated differently. And we are often looking at least up to now, this is starting to shift, but that we're looking from a binary perspective, that, oh, we even design bedrooms around the gender of the child. So when it's born, we might design a nursery in pink, because we know we're having a girl, or might design the nursery in blue colors, which tend to be more male colors, if we know we're having a little boy. So there's a lot of kind of gender messaging and conditioning that goes into kids at this age, anywhere from just the environment of their room being decorated in things that are traditionally male or traditionally female, to what their parents dress them as. You might put a pink bow in a child's hair or in a baby's hair, particularly if they don't have hair. A lot of people will put a little bow and dress them in pink so that everybody knows it's a girl, versus, putting them in blue or other traditionally male colors, if they have a little boy. There's been some movement now, to having more gender neutral bedrooms or nurseries for kids, and more gender neutral clothing for them as they grow. But traditionally, that really hasn't been the case. It's been more binary in nature around, having a boy or a girl. Um, but there may be some experimentation with kids around gender things, where they might, play with different toys, or, girls might like to play in mud and, get dirty or play with trucks, and boys might play with dolls, things like that. So there may be some kind of experimentation there, and depending on the type of play or toys that might be available in their environment, they may be drawn to different kinds of toys that may not be traditionally, um, you know, toys that they would play with as a boy or a girl. So again, there's some movement here in the kind of toys that are given to kids, and parents or caregivers may be a little bit more intentional about the toys that are given to kids, that there may be some more gender neutral toys, or they might give their kids, some traditionally boy toys like trucks and race cars and things like that, and also give them dolls, or um, things like that that might be more traditionally girl toys to play with, and see kind of what they gravitate towards. Okay, so there's also an exploration of their own body, where they're learning to identify their hands, their feet, their tummy, their genitals too. They may enjoy nudity. I know lots of kids that don't like to wear clothes or wear diapers, and they just really have no shame, and they run around naked, and they don't care. They don't care who's around. So there's just a kind of an exploration or a learning of their body and the different body parts. Then there's toilet training that comes in around 2 or 3, typically, and where they're learning about how their body works, and how, they feel the sensation of needing to go to the bathroom, and where to go to the bathroom. They learn things about, shutting the door when you go to the bathroom. They learn things about hygiene, how to take care of their bodies, or keep their bodies clean. Also learning about, when taking baths, often this age range is learning how to clean themselves in the bath, and practicing cleaning themselves, with the help of an adult, at this age, up until the age of 3. But they're kind of learning all these pieces about their body. There also may be some curiosity about the differences between bodies, like, why does my body look like this and it's different than yours? Or about their siblings or their parents or caregivers' bodies. Oftentimes, parents, might take showers or baths with their kids at this point, this age. And so there's oftentimes a curiosity about, the parent's body or caregiver's body as a result. Okay, so late childhood sexuality, ages 4 to 8, there may be some sexual play starting to happen, like playing doctor, or I'll show you mine if you show me yours, kind of thing. There's again some more gender role learning, how to behave like a girl or behave like a boy, and that's maybe a conditioning process. Usually they're in school, so they may have the added influences of teachers or caregivers at school or daycare, and then the other kids, of course. They might learn words, sex words around like bathroom vocabulary, so farting and pooping, and they may like to talk about that because it's sort of taboo and it's funny. They may start to ask questions about pregnancy, about birth, how are babies made, how are babies born, which are always fun and interesting conversations to have with kids. They're starting to learn what's acceptable and unacceptable behavior because they may be getting in trouble for doing things or saying things. So, again, this is a bit of a conditioning process where they're learning what they can talk about, what they can't talk about, that kind of stuff, which may be some gender and sexuality related concepts, like, oh, we don't talk about potty talk, like we don't talk about farts and poops and things like that. Or they may be learning, that they may be learning certain language around genitals. People have like little cutesy names, like, oh, you got to go potty instead of going to the bathroom, or oh, you got a TT instead of you got to go to the bathroom. Or may call various parts of the body, particularly genitalia, by different names rather than penis or vagina or things like that. So kind of learning through those terms that it may not be acceptable to call certain body parts by certain names, things like that. There's the possibility of some masturbation or self-stimulation just as they're learning their bodies here. They may also become more modest about their own body because they're learning kind of that acceptable social norms. So running around naked is not socially acceptable for kids, particularly higher, like in the 7 to 8 year old. They might be learning about good touch, bad touch kinds of concepts, like where if certain people touch you in these areas, that's not good and needs to be told to an adult, things like that. Then there's also the media influences and whatever they're watching, whether it's cartoons, TV shows, YouTube videos, whatever, social media type of messaging. They're learning about gender through those kind of societal and media influences and learning about sexuality as a result. So there's also that element. And then the element of their peers at school or in the neighborhood that might be kind of teaching them things about gender or about sexuality. So thinking back to the early childhood sexuality and this stage of 4 to 8 year olds, so where does addiction influence sexuality in these areas or vice versa? So at this point, most of the time, kids are not using substances or engaging in addictive behavior themselves, but they may have caregivers or other family members, siblings, parents, things like that, other adults that may be around them a lot who do have addictions or engage in substance use. So they might see paraphernalia around, or alcohol around, or see people drinking, or see people actively being intoxicated or high. So they learn a lot about addiction and about kind of the family goings on based on what they see in their environment. They may also learn about kind of keeping secrets of family members. Oh, we don't talk about, um, your brother John's addiction. So they learn that they're not to tell other people, they're not to tell their friends, they're not to tell their teachers, or just talk about it in general. So most of the time now, at the 8-year-old and above, they may be starting to experiment with substances, if they have access to it as well. But typically, it's more other people are doing it and they're learning something about addiction at this point. Or they may be neglected because a parent or caregiver is using substances or engaging in addictive behavior, and can't take care of them, or they may move from, they may be removed from their biological parents related due to addiction or things like that. So there may be some involvement of the Department of Child Services or some entity like that related to the addiction of parents or caregivers. The other thing that can happen, as you all know, is child abuse or sexual abuse at this point. And that really has impacts on sexuality and how a child develops sexually and in terms of gender, which can have a myriad of consequences. But this is something to be considered in these age groups that may be a factor in what's going on with them. Okay, so moving on to early adolescent sexuality, which is kind of the 9 to 11 years old, and then we'll get to the kind of later adolescent sexuality in the next slide. But here's where puberty is really starting at this point. So there may be some body changes, mood changes, particularly hormones. Kids, this is kind of the preteen, uh, preteen, what's the word I'm looking for? Just preteen, I guess, where they, could start getting real sassy and having an attitude, or pulling away from parents, not wanting to spend as much time with their parents, wanting to be with their peers more. But from a physiological standpoint, puberty is starting. Menstruation or sperm production may begin for some bodies in this early stage. It seems like kids are, starting their or girls are starting their menstrual cycles earlier, and kids are just kind of developing earlier. So that could be happening at this age. There's the possibility of masturbation again, where they're starting to explore their bodies. They may engage in closeness of same or similar gender identifying relationships. So they may want to be around who, their same gender, and they may or may not want to be around other genders. There's also the possibility of body exploration with others. And usually this is more from a curiosity standpoint rather than a sexual attraction standpoint, but could be. Kind of depends on how their puberty goes. And some kids may not be engaging in puberty at this point. It may come a little bit later. But it's a possibility, and every kid's a little bit different in that regard. So again, from the addiction standpoint, often it's still adults or other, older siblings, things like that, that may be around them using addiction, or engaging in addiction or substance use. But there also may be some kind of experimentation going on with kids in this age range, which again, depending on, how they're developing and what they have access to and what their friend group is or other influences in the environment might be, they can start to develop some addiction qualities of their own. or behaviors of their own where they may start drinking or smoking cigarettes or smoking vapes. That's been kind of a more recent thing where kids are using vapes and which could have tobacco or nicotine or could have THC or marijuana in them. Just kind of depends. But when that starts to be introduced, then their brain development can be impacted when they start using substances, which also can impact their development socially from a sexuality and gender perspective. So, all kinds of impacts could happen if they start using substances at an early age because of that brain development and that emotional development potentially being stunted by the substance use. So again, it's more of an access issue and what they have available to them and who's around them, but also the adults in their world that could be using substances and what they learn about that. And then again, we also have the abuse standpoint um, around physical, sexual, or emotional abuse that could be happening. That again interplays with how they develop sexually and their sexuality and with gender as well. Okay, so late adolescence or 12 to 18 years, again, puberty is in full swing at this point, usually. Menstrual cycles, sperm production is beginning, again, masturbation, but this is where attraction may really start, where they start becoming attracted to other people. They may find other people attractive. They may want to kiss them, touch them, have their first kinds of sexual experiences, unless they had some sexual abuse previous to this. But this is where they're beginning to explore from a sexuality perspective, explore sexual experiences with others, or at least think about it. Even if they're not physically engaging in it, they're starting to think about it and often have attraction to others. There's a greater awareness of their own sexual identity and gender identity and that of others around them. So again, the possibility of sexual activity, possibility of pregnancy or STIs, possibility of need for contraception or information about sex safety decisions. This is often where, like, if kids are going to high school, they may have some element of the birds and the bees, sex education in school, or parents or caregivers may provide that. But kind of the hallmark of adolescence is a strong need for independence. So this is where they're really going from being a kid to being an adult, and hopefully, can kind of leave the house and launch and be successful in life after the age of 18. So there's this push and pull of, what the family that I grew up in, my, kind of beliefs, my family's beliefs with, what are I believing um, as a young person? And are those two things in line? But also there's the media, social media is a big, strong influence. Peer groups are a huge influence at this age. So from a sexuality and gender developmental perspective, there's a lot of kind of exploration um, and perhaps experimenting with anything really sexuality related, which could mean kind of from an attraction standpoint, maybe they're experimenting with different genders and engaging in some sexual activity with different genders. They could also be um, having some experimentation around their own gender identity and what are, kind of from a psychological perspective or an internal perspective, what gender are they identifying with? Or are they kind of feeling more gender neutral, that they don't really identify with a particular gender, maybe gender queer? So again, that's kind of the push and pull, and it's a big time of experimentation, which also means that they may be experimenting with substances or with other types of addiction that are out there. And so oftentimes it is just an experimentation or a phase of life kind of thing where they might drink for a little while or experiment with drinking, may have some drunken type episodes. Also drugs, may try different kinds of drugs, may experiment with that. And then for some kids, they do develop more of an addiction or a habit around substance use, which can really impact their brain cognitive development, but also their emotional development. And we typically see in addiction treatment where, the time at which somebody starts using substances regularly is also where they're emotionally stunted a bit. So if someone starts using substances at age 16 and they're using substances regularly through the age of, let's say, 30, then when they stop using substances or try to get into recovery at the age of 30, then it may seem like they're kind of the emotional age of a 16-year-old because their emotional development was stunted at that point because they were using substances to cope. And so emotions and learning how to navigate emotions were not were not adequately developed at that point. So now at the age of 30, they're going back and learning things that they maybe should have learned in their teenage years. Okay, so youth or young adult sexuality, ages 19 to 30. Um, so this is possibility of sexual activity with a partner. In terms of relationships, there may be partnerships, relationships, marriage, family life, careers, decision making around all of those things, possibility of masturbation, possibility of pregnancy, childbirth, parenting, possibility of using contraception or sex safety decisions, and then the possibility of relationships ending. So this is a big age range of 11 years. A lot can happen in that time. And in terms of career, somebody may be getting settled in a career, going through schooling through this decade or so. And from an addiction perspective, that is also interwoven in here and has a lot of implications for relationships and careers, um, and things like that around, if people are engaging in addictive behavior or substance use during this time, if they're having children of their own, um, and they're using substances, then that's going to have impact on their children. So addiction can have lots of far reaching impacts, from minimal impacts to severe impacts of kind of losing a lot of these things, losing careers, losing relationships, family estrangement, things like that due to the addiction. But also any kind of trauma that is experienced, and I'm going to say this repeatedly through all the rest of the life phases, any trauma that's experienced through here also has an impact around sexuality and gender, or could have an impact around sexuality and gender. And so these are the kinds of things that people are struggling with in these ages, and there can be transitions here too and throughout the rest of the life regarding sexuality and gender, where people gain more and more self-awareness and thereby learning more about themselves, learning more about kind of the world around them and what might be socially acceptable, or what might have been socially acceptable as a kid may or may not be socially acceptable now, or that may be shifting. So for example, growing up, I don't recall any time where anyone talked about any other kind of gender other than male or female. And now through, from my childhood up until now, I've learned that there are other things. There are different definitions and evolving kind of genders that are not just the binary male and female. And so that can shift over the course of time. And as society evolves and changes, so do we as people. And that can have implications for how we identify gender wise, but also how we engage sexually. Um, and as, kind of the LGBTQIA plus community has shifted and evolved and lobbied and advocated for themselves along with allies coming in and advocating, then things have become more socially acceptable now than what they used to be, whereas people used to have to keep those things as secrets or feel like they had to keep them as secrets because of the societal stigma. So again, all of this can be happening throughout any of the lifespan, but becomes more prominent here in this stage because this is where people are often fully independent from their caregivers and their family of origin. And so they're starting to make adult decisions around, what do I believe? What do I kind of my own identity? What do I want to be or want to ascribe to in terms of a belief system? And so there's lots of impacts around um, sexuality and gender as a result. So adult sexuality, again, a lot of the same concepts as the previous phase, but there's possibility of partner selection. There's the concept perhaps of long-term partnership where there's a maintenance of a relationship. Um, so that can be an intimate relationship, but also can be just intimate relationships with friends, with family members, but also intimate relationships with partners that are of a sexual nature. And how do we maintain that over time? And how does our sexuality change over time throughout the course of that relationship? Um, Again, possibility of masturbation, parenting responsibilities are more common here, where you might have to provide sex education for your own children. There's the possibility of pregnancy, childbirth, decision making around contraception, sex safety. There may be medical procedures around not being able to get pregnant again, like vasectomies or tubes tied, things like that. The possibility of grandparenting is introduced here, where if you had children young, then your children may be having children at this point. And then, of course, the possibility of ending relationships, where relationships are come to an end, whether it's a romantic relationship or just friendships. And that all has implications and influences on kind of our sexuality and gender as we grow throughout the years and across the lifespan. And again, where addiction comes in, again, it's pretty much the same as the last phase. It can have a variety of consequences. Same thing for trauma. It just kind of depends, but can also have a variety of influences on sexuality too. And then, oops, adult sexuality around 46 to 64 years. This is pretty much the same as what we saw before, but there is the added piece of perhaps going through menopause or andropause. Again, possibility of grandparenting, and all the rest are the same except for this bottom one, the possibility of divorce or death of a partner or spouse is more common here, although can be in any life phase up to this point. And then the addiction and the trauma pieces are the same here. And then adult sexuality, really 65 years and on, the body still responds sexually, but maybe more slowly, or may need some help in terms of medication to respond. There's again the element of grandparenting or even great grandparenting. Need for physical affection may be more prevalent here. The rest is the same until we get down to the possibility of other health issues affecting sexual activity. So our bodies start to have aches and pains of aging, and we may have other health things that are going on that are affecting our sexual activity here, and maybe affecting libido or performance, things like that. And then again, the possibility of death of a partner or spouse. So the addiction and trauma issues can also be components here in the same way they were in the previous phases. Okay, so we're gonna take a break here. We're gonna take, let's see, we'll take a 5-minute break since we're at 3:55 right now. We'll take a 5 to 7-minute break and then come back on this same link and we'll continue on. So I'm gonna leave this up and mute myself and my camera and take a few minutes. Okay, so we're gonna go ahead and get started. So the first hour or the first part of this presentation was really about human development across the lifespan and how sexuality and addiction, and trauma as well is kind of all influences each other throughout the lifespan. So this second part, we're really going to focus more on if we're working with clients that are struggling with addiction, how the impact of sexuality, gender identification, and trauma all kind of interplay, and what that means for what we need to do from a treatment standpoint on how to help somebody in that position. So first, let's start with the impact of addiction. So if you weren't here in the first half, no problem. We went through the developmental kind of stages throughout life. So let's talk about the impact of addiction throughout the throughout the lifespan. So any of these things can kind of happen at any point in time across the lifespan and have varying consequences. So I'm going to kind of run through these fairly quickly so we can get more to the treatment pieces. But brain and body development can potentially be stunted. I gave an example earlier of when a teenager, like say a 16-year-old, starts using substances and uses regularly, maybe up until the age of 30. When they stop using substances at the age of 30, they will often emotionally and even from a cognitive standpoint to some degree be a little bit stunted or a little bit delayed back to that teenager time from when they started using. So you may see a 30-year-old person standing in front of you who looks like an adult, but kind of acts or behaves or has some emotional dysregulation like a teenager because of the impact of the substances. And so that also might be the case for sexuality. And we talked about all the varying components of sexuality at the very beginning of the part one presentation. But just as kind of some examples of how that might be impacted is, if somebody felt like they didn't really fit in because maybe of their sexual orientation or gender, maybe it wasn't socially acceptable in wherever they were for whatever reason. And so they started using substances. Well, now when they're trying to get into recovery and we may be seeing them in our offices for counseling, and well, now they got to kind of deal with those sexuality components of perhaps their sexual orientation or their gender identity. Otherwise, it's just going to kind of keep feeding the addiction and they keep feeding each other. And so we have to look at it from an integrated perspective. We can't just treat the addiction and ignore any sexuality related concerns that may be there. So that's important to pay attention to. And that kind of leads into these next few points on the slide around things that they might have engaged in while actively addicted that can have impacts on their sexuality, gender identity, and need to be kind of dealt with in the course of treatment when they come into our offices. So there may have been some prostitution or sex work. They may have been turning tricks where they engaged in sexual acts for money or for drugs, or if they had a sexual addiction, then that could be a component. This concept of kind of gay for pay, which I'm in New Orleans, Louisiana, that's a term used quite a bit around here, where people might be working as go-go dancers at bars or at strip clubs or at various types of bars like that. And they also might engage in some sex work as a result. And they may not identify as being gay or being in the LGBT community, but they will, if they're being paid for a service, they will engage in a sex act. So they call it being gay for pay. Like, I don't identify as being gay, but if you're going to pay me, then I'll engage in sexual acts with kind of anybody. So there may be all those elements, and some people have trauma related to those pieces and others don't. I've worked with a lot of clients that have told me that if sex work were legal, they would, that they would continue to engage in it because they enjoyed it. But then also there's other people who felt like they had to engage in sex work in order to make ends meet, or in order to kind of survive, and they've had trauma from those experiences. So, they can kind of be anywhere along that continuum. But if we're not assessing for that and not talking to our clients about those kinds of things, then we're never, we don't know, and we can't really help them in that regard. Sex trafficking, human trafficking is kind of its own thing, but often drugs are used as a component of sex trafficking to keep somebody docile or to keep somebody involved in the trafficking and whatever that entails. So oftentimes we get people into treatment that have not only a substance use problem, but they also have significant trauma from their experiences in the human trafficking element. And so we have to really treat those from an integrated perspective. We can't just treat the addiction without treating the trauma as well, and kind of helping them to process and move past that. Intimate partner violence is something that is very commonplace among people with addiction, whether they've been the victim or the perpetrator of intimate partner violence. It's a common thing because people kind of act different when they're on drugs and or drunk. And so there may be, kind of abusive relationships that happen as a result of just the substance use and how it changes and people's behavior and perhaps makes them more aggressive, but then also that kind of cycle of violence and addiction that kind of feed each other, that can be problematic and needs to be addressed. Sexual assault can happen at any point along the lifespan. And again, that's a trauma and could be a very complex trauma if there was assault that happened over the course of time. Whether it was one event or multiple events, it still needs to be kind of addressed, because oftentimes that's what feeds addiction, is their guilt and shame around sexual assault and around, kind of what does that mean for their sexuality? What does that mean related to their sexual orientation? There can be lots of questions and lots of doubts around that. And so that can really feed an addiction as well and needs to be addressed. Sexual dysfunction is a common element of substance use. So there's kind of two sides of it. There's probably more, but two that I think of right off the top of my head. One is that people feel kind of performance anxiety around sex. And this can be anywhere along the lifespan as well, where, having a little bit of liquid courage in the terms of maybe drinking a little bit can help you be a little bit more confident to engage in some sexual behavior or sexual activity that maybe you wouldn't have been as comfortable with, or would have taken a lot longer for you to get comfortable with without the substance. Then also, using substances over the course of time can cause sexual performance issues, erectile dysfunction, inability to orgasm, decreased or increased libido. There can be all of those elements related to the substance use. But then when somebody stops using substances or stops engaging in the addiction, then there can be sexual dysfunction then as well, because they've had a period of time where they've been using substances, so they haven't been thinking about or, engaging in sex sober. And so now engaging in sex sober may be very uncomfortable. There may be, again, some erectile dysfunction, some inability to orgasm, or just discomfort, shame, guilt around engaging in sexual activity without substances. And oftentimes what happens is when somebody gets into recovery, their libido kind of tanks because they're coming off of the substances and their bodies are trying to adjust to this new level of sobriety. And so often that impacts the libido and makes it decrease. And then there's also the sexually transmitted illnesses that are a component of addiction. And if they engaged in unsafe sex or unprotected sex, then there's obviously the possibility of sexually transmitted illnesses, but also pregnancy or unwanted pregnancies can occur throughout that time as well, which can have all kinds of again, consequences to it. So these are all kind of things that we need to pay attention to when it comes to somebody who's engaging in an addiction that may come in for treatment, but also how all of these pieces impact sexuality. And if we're not kind of including these elements in our assessments and if in our kind of regular things that we talk to clients about through the course of treatment, then then we might be missing something. And it's important for us as counselors and counseling professionals to normalize conversations around these things, that it's okay to talk about these things. And this is a welcoming and open and judgment-free zone to talk about these things. So it's important to keep those in mind kind of as we continue. Okay, these are just some stats about sexual performance. And these are old stats from the 80s, but they're still applicable and they're still the same even now. This is particularly around women, sexual dysfunctions for women caused by addiction, which include lack of desire, arousal issues, lubrication issues, and orgasm issues, painful intercourse or vaginal spasms. All of these things can be problematic. And one particular study found that 69% of women who are alcoholics reported having experienced sexual dysfunctions prior to their addiction. And 85% experienced these things while addicted. And then 74% suffered from continual sexual dysfunction during their early recovery. And honestly, I don't know, based on these studies, whether they improved their sexual functioning over time as they were recovering, because the study didn't go that far. But what we do know and what the study does tell us is that sexual dysfunction is common in addiction, but also prior to addiction and in recovery, particularly in women, but also the same is true for men, even though this study was particularly related to women. So that's kind of something to think about when you're treating somebody that may have an addiction or somebody that may be struggling with sexual related issues, whether it's kind of gender identity, if they're transitioning at all, that can have impacts on their sexual activity and sexual interest and arousal, particularly if they're taking hormones or have had medical procedures and surgeries that may have changed the way their genitalia functions. And so adjusting to that and being able to have satisfying sex as a result of those things can also be a concern. And a lot of people tend to use substances to assist with any sexual issues, because it's just basically used as a coping strategy, which can then, depending on kind of the habit around that and what's going on with the person, they may develop an addiction as a result. So again, things to keep in mind and things to pay attention to as you're working with these populations. Just other effects that are out there: cocaine use can cause delayed or impaired ejaculation in men, particularly. Heroin use can make it particularly difficult for women to reach orgasm. Marijuana can lead to erectile dysfunction by decreasing the sensation in their stimulation receptors within the penis. And then alcohol reduces inhibitions in general, but lowers the physiological signs of arousal. So this can cause kind of decreased arousal or diminished intensity of orgasm, or just difficulty attaining orgasm in general. So substances can have a big impact on our sexual functioning, and then has larger impacts around sexuality kind of in general. And as we look at sexuality as kind of an umbrella term for all kinds of, there's all components of that that can be impacted by addiction and substance use in particular. Okay, so one of the things that has been happening in the past while, I would say, is that our definition of gender is evolving. And while that's done a lot of things for being inclusive of people who identify in various ways and giving people language and terminology and vocabulary around gender that's different from our binary concepts of male and female, It's also been a challenge from a counselor perspective to deal with. And then also how that impacts, working with clients with addiction, because particularly the LGBTQIA plus community is at a higher risk for substance use in general, and then thereby, developing addictions. So all of these elements need to be included where we're looking at sexuality related concerns and the addiction related concerns, and really treating somebody and working with somebody from an integrated standpoint. So let's talk about some of these changes. So I created this little graphic that I've used in a lot of areas that kind of helps people conceptualize gender in a different way. You see gender as kind of that umbrella term, that red bubble with all of these sort of little bubbles attached. So I see gender as a very umbrella term with all these components underneath of it. So one being biology, which is your genetic, physical genitalia, chromosomes, hormones, those kinds of things from a biological perspective. That is one component of gender. But then there's also identity, which is really a psychological sense of self. So how do I internally identify? And then there's the expression component of how do I share my gender or express my gender to the world and to people around me. But I think what's really a separate component aside from gender is sexual orientation. So sexual orientation is all about attraction and who you are attracted to, who you want to have sex with, which the way you identify from a gender perspective is completely different from who you're attracted to. So that's why sexual orientation really has the X over it, because that's not something that is really a component of gender, which can be kind of confusing, because a lot of people associate kind of biology with sexual orientation. So if you have, if you're biologically quote unquote a female, and I put that in quotes for a reason, which we'll talk about in a minute, but if you're biologically quote unquote a female, then if you're attracted to other females, then that would mean you're a lesbian. If you're attracted to men, that means you're heterosexual. And that's kind of been our historically binary concept of not only gender, but also sexual orientation. And that's been evolving. So I think now at this point, sexual orientation is really a completely separate idea around, attraction. And then gender is separate, which includes these other components of biology, identity, and expression. So let's break these out a little bit separately. So looking at biology, we have anatomy, chromosomes, and hormones. So if you look at kind of the left side of the screen, if you can see the screen, then I think it's your left anyways. There's a blue bubble that says male in quotes. And the reason it's in quotes is because this is kind of our historical idea of what constitutes a male. So a male has XY chromosomes, has heavy testosterone in the terms related to hormones, although they do have some estrogen. It's more prevalent to have testosterone. And then they have genitalia or gonads that are specific to what we traditionally think of as male. Then on the other side is a pinkish purplish bubble that has female in quotes. And females are traditionally identified as an XX chromosome, XY chromosome. They have heavier estrogen than testosterone, and they have genitalia that's traditionally associated with being female. And then we kind of have people in the middle. We have intersex, which there's kind of two pieces to someone who might be intersex. They may have a combination of genitalia or chromosomes or hormones of both male and female. Or they may have had a biological sex identified during infancy through medical procedures, where perhaps they had some genitalia that was not functioning properly, or they had, an extra genitalia for some reason. and that there are medical procedures performed to have them in more fit into one of the categories of either male or female. So those are kind of two components. Some people live their whole lives with a combination of these gonads, chromosomes, and hormones, and other people have had medical procedures um, to to kind of shift that so that they're in one category or the other of either male or female. And then we have the concept of people being transgender, where they may be transitioning um, from male to female or female to male. And that's kind of been our historical ideas of biology. And I think that's shifting, where we have people now that are that maybe continue to have genitalia of male, but they may be living and dress and identify and express themselves as female, or could be gender neutral, where they don't really identify in either category of the binary categories of gender. So biology is only one component, and I think it's interesting to see how that is shifting, that what we see biologically in a person may or may not be how they identify or how they express themselves related to their gender. So I think that's been a challenge for some people to understand. Okay, so here's just some pictures to kind of drive this point home. We've got Marilyn Monroe in the middle, who's kind of the quintessential feminine woman. We've got a representation on the right of quintessentially male or traditional male. And then on the left, we have someone who's a little bit more androgynous, which not necessarily clearly identifiable as male or female. So kind of somewhere in the middle, perhaps, or something different than the traditional concepts of male and female. Okay, let's move on to identity. So gender identity has to do with an internal process or a psychological sense of self. So how do I personally identify? What gender do I identify as? Or do I identify as a particular gender? So all of these terms on here are not an exhaustive list by any means, but just some things you might hear that I went through the definitions of in the beginning of part one, but just to point out a few that have kind of evolved. So somebody who identifies as gender fluid, for example, since we have the binary, we've historically had the binary concepts of gender being male or female. So now somebody who identifies as gender fluid, it's kind of the idea that gender is more on a continuum rather than being exclusively male or female. Someone can kind of be somewhere in the middle or kind of flow between genders. So don't necessarily identify as one gender or another, but kind of moves through all of them or has components of all genders. We have, let's see, we already talked about transgender. Cisgender is something where it depends on if you identify as the gender that you were assigned at birth. So, when the doctor pulls the baby out and says, it's a boy, it's a girl, that tends to be the gender identified at birth or assigned at birth based on what the doctor sees in the genitalia of the baby. So if you identify now as the same as your gender identified at birth or sex assigned at birth, then that would mean you are cisgender. So for example, I'm a female, I identify as being female, I was assigned female at birth, so I am cisgender or cis female. Same thing for men. Third gender, if somebody identifies as third gender, that might mean that they don't identify in either of the binary categories of female or male, but they identify as a different or a third gender. So it's something different than male or female, but not necessarily identified other than a third gender. So again, this is how somebody identifies inside, inside themselves, gender wise. So here's some examples just from celebrities that have identified themselves um, as being non-binary or not ascribing to the traditional ideas of male and female. So kind of, you can also see some fashion statements, which we'll talk about a little bit in the expression part, but just kind of pushing the boundaries of what we've traditionally thought of as what is a man, what is a woman, and is there something else besides just male and female? And then lastly, the expression piece. So this is how we communicate our gender to the rest of the world. Um, and so this has a lot to do with fashion, the way we present ourselves, the way we cut our hair, do we wear makeup or not, that kind of thing, which this can all be very different from the way that we identify. So drag is a good example um, of an identity, a gender identity being a little bit different than gender expression. So, for example, someone who identifies as male and dresses in drag means that they often dress in a more feminine way. So, they tend to be performers. So, maybe they're going to have a performance. They do put a lot of makeup on. They might wear a wig. They might dress, in a dress or in, um, you know, whatever they're performing in, depending on what kind of performance they're doing. But they don't necessarily identify as male, but they dress and drag and do performances as what looks like a woman. So that's a good example of where somebody's identity may be very different from their expression. Somebody might identify as female or identify as gender neutral and dress in a more masculine way, and they might have their hair cut short. That might be of a more masculine type haircut. Um, Things like that. So like looking at these examples of people kind of expressing themselves in a different way. You have David Bowie dressing in, kind of a play on a dress there. Then you have RuPaul at the bottom dressing in drag. And then you have more gender neutral clothing on the people up at the top of the screen, where based on their clothing, they look more gender neutral. It's not necessarily masculine, not necessarily feminine. It's just kind of more neutral, somewhere in the middle. So people can express themselves in all kinds of ways. And again, that wasn't an exhaustive list of terms or concepts, but kind of all of these components together of biology, identity, and expression are all components of gender, but in and of themselves don't define somebody's gender. We kind of need all of those components to understand somebody's gender. Okay, so what does this mean for counselors? And then we're going to talk about the addiction components as well shortly. Is that counselors can have a lot of challenges here with gender, the idea and the concept of gender evolving. Really, it's just kind of keeping up with the terminology changes, the definition changes, particularly in your community, which may have very different terms for things than other communities do. So kind of knowing and keeping up with your community and kind of what's going on in your community and the varying terms that might be used or vocabulary that might be used, understanding the vocabulary of the client. So I might understand what I think a particular term means, but it's important to ask the client what that means to them, because I may be assuming that I understand what the client's talking about when I really don't. A big component is adding gender and sexuality kind of questions and assessment processes to our assessments or our intakes. So are you asking new clients about their gender and about their sexuality? And perhaps they've gone through some kind of an evolution with their gender and sexuality. And so what does that mean to them? It doesn't have any implications for treatment, for whatever we're doing from a counseling perspective. Are there concerns about gender? Maybe they're struggling with their identity, or sexuality, same thing. So are we assessing for those things? And when we use electronic health records, where we might have to use standard assessment tools that may not have some of these questions or some of these elements in it, that can be a challenge. Using the correct pronouns for somebody and remembering what pronouns they want, they want you to use when referring to them. Managed care implications for transitioning clients. This is something that, I know in my own practice, I've really struggled with, because the way that we have to bill, at least this is the case in Louisiana. I'm not sure if any other states have figured this out or gotten a little bit more progressive and made this easier. But in Louisiana, I have to bill for somebody under their legal name and their legal gender that is on their ID, as well as their insurance. So let's say I have a client that's transitioning and his name is Joe, and identified as male. So Joe Smith identified as male on his insurance and ID, but their name is Sally and they identify as female and want me to use she, her pronouns. So in their medical record, oftentimes, and through billing, submitting claim forms to insurance companies, I have to use their legal name and what's on their insurance, which may not be what they want to be called and what they identify with at this point. So remembering those components and being able to, and some electronic health records handle this better, where there's like a preferred name or an alias or something that you can put in, so it can identify them by the proper name that they are going by at this point. But then also, the gender may be different, and we still have to put those things on claim forms. At least we do here in Louisiana. So adjusting to that is challenging, and remembering so that I'm treating my client in the way that's, acknowledging who they are, and also still being able, from a billing standpoint, to get paid for services. Those two things are kind of at odds at times, particularly with clients that are transitioning. And we still function societally in a lot of ways in this binary concept of male and female, and that there's no other gender option. So a lot of times on forms and things that we have to fill out, we have to identify gender, and that may or may not be a binary gender. And oftentimes there's not other options. The only options are male or female. So that can be really challenging. Another piece that can be challenging as a counselor is community resources. Are there community resources out there for what your clients are struggling with? So for example, in the addiction world, 12-step meetings are really a popular support or resource for clients. So are there 12-step meetings that they can go to where they feel comfortable in? So are there LGBTQ plus 12-step meetings in the community, or can they access them online? Or there may be, if a client's, transgender, that maybe going to a transgender 12-step meeting would be an ideal situation for them, where they feel a sense of community with other people that might be struggling with the same things, or similar things at least, that what they're struggling with. So some of those resources just may not be available in the community where you live. Now, the nice thing, honestly, that came out of COVID was the availability of online 12-step meetings and online support groups. So those may be more accessible for clients now than they have ever been in the past. And then we have also the element of trauma. So if we have a client that's struggling, with sexuality or gender related concerns, with trauma, and then also with addiction or substance use, then we really have to look at all of those things together in an integrated manner. And that just adds layers to the treatment and to what we're working with clients on from a counseling perspective and from an intervention perspective. Figuring out what is going to be the best types of interventions for this client can be really challenging based on what they're presenting. Okay, I'm not going to go through adverse childhood experiences other than to say they can be really important and have a lot of implications from a sexuality standpoint and also from an addiction standpoint. So I think I'm assuming at this point, maybe this is an unsafe assumption, but I'm assuming you've heard about the adverse childhood experiences scale. Here's the questions. It's 10 questions, basically asking about prior to the age of 18, did any of these things happen to you? And based on the score, then that gives us an outcome. So for women, 34.5% of women have zero, 38% of men have zero, from in terms of the score on the ACE. Then we kind of go through four or more. So people that have four or more yes answers to those 10 ACE questions, um, about 15.2% of women, 9.2% of men, and there's a total kind of in the general population of 12.5% that have four or more ACEs. And what that means, why it matters how many of those questions they answer yes to, is that it has these implications. So in the general population of people that have taken the ACE score, or I mean, taken the ACE test and then it's been scored, that recurrent and severe physical abuse is about 11% of people. 11% of people have recurrent and severe emotional abuse from childhood. Again, this is all from childhood. Contact sexual abuse was about 22%. Growing up with an alcoholic or a drug user, 24%. And that's 1 in 4 when you're looking at 24%. Growing up with a family member in prison, 3%. Growing up with a family member with a mental illness, 19%. Growing up seeing your mother being treated violently, 12%. Growing up with both parents not being present, 22%. Again, getting close to that 1 in 4. So why does that matter? That these people have experienced this. Well, what it means for addiction is that women in particular are 50% more likely than men to have experienced 5 or more adverse childhood experiences. And the higher the ACE score, the higher the chances of addiction to alcohol and other drugs in adulthood. So people who have 4 or more ACEs in general had a 500% increase in risk for adult alcoholism, which is huge. That's a huge number. Men with 6 or more ACEs, 4,600% increase in risk for being an IV drug user. And 78% of IV drug use in women can be attributed to adverse childhood experiences. So this element of trauma from childhood or adverse childhood experiences from childhood increase the risk for addiction, but also increase the risk for just having challenges in adulthood in general. So I haven't seen studies on how the ACEs scores relate to sexuality in general, but I imagine based on other studies that there is implications, and there are implications for higher ACE scores. So this was Vince Folletti. Dr. Folletti is one of the guys that started the ACEs in his clinic. And basically he said that that their findings through the ACEs and this has been massive research studies have been done at this point around the ACEs. But basically he's saying that the basic causes of addiction maybe aren't about drug dealers and dangerous chemicals, that it's more in the way that we treat each other. And you think about all the ACEs questions are around childhood experiences where, parents have either not been around or treated the child poorly. So kind of a profound statement that maybe we've spent a lot of money kind of in the war on drugs, and maybe that wasn't a good place for the money. So kind of an interesting perspective from him. And so what that means for treatment is that it's important to assess these ACEs and that they have implications for addiction, but also that we need to take into account and work with clients from a trauma-informed care model, and that we include gender and sexual affirming care within our treatment as well. So using appropriate pronouns of what people want to be called and referred to as. Avoiding assumptions like sex work is bad, or men do this, or women do this, which is often just, analyzing our own biases. Using inclusive language, avoiding jargon or stereotypes, being culturally sensitive, getting additional training and working with LGBTQ plus populations, if that's a population that you intend to work with, and getting additional training. So you make sure that you're taking care, paying attention to all the unique needs that might be there for that community. Promote inclusivity in treatment groups or programs. If you operate a program or are a counselor in a particular type of program or running groups, then you might have to do some work around educating your other group members about, like, what does it mean to be transgender? Or you might specifically have groups that are, some treatment facilities have a lot of gender specific groups, which can be challenging because historically it's just been male or female groups. Well, now that gender is evolving, then how do you handle what groups people are put into, and how are the other group members going to respond so that we can manage bullying and kind of avoid somebody being stigmatized or discriminated against in a group setting. So there may be some work you have to do around educating the other group members, or figuring out how to do groups in a way that that might be more affirming for people that don't identify in the binary ways, or in the binary concepts of just male and female. Include sex positivity and body positivity, discuss healthy sexuality and expression, which, healthy sexuality and expression is somewhat subjective. And so again, this is a awareness piece and an insight piece for counselors, is to explore our own biases around sexuality, around what does healthy sexuality mean, what does expression of sexuality or gender mean, are we kind of open from a counseling perspective to other concepts, and maybe expand our ideas of what healthy sexuality and expression is. And then sexual wellness integration, which includes looking at relationships and the sexual health of relationships that our clients might be in, which can be around intimacy, particularly if they're coming off of substances and they may struggle with intimacy and talking about feelings with their partners. There may be pleasure concerns or satisfaction concerns, which could include some sexual dysfunction as components to it, and how to be intimate with partners and have sexual experiences with partners when you're sober versus when you are using substances, and how to deal with some of the guilt and shame that may be there around sexual things that people may have done during their active addiction. So all of this can be incorporated in your work as a counselor to kind of be more affirming from a sexuality standpoint, and also from a trauma-informed standpoint, because we can really, if we're not that we're intending to, but we can accidentally kind of be offensive and shut down a client from wanting to share with us, and that doesn't help them. So one of the ways we can do that is by using the proper pronouns that people want to be called. So we have the typical gender binary ones that we already know: he, him for someone who identifies as male, or she, her for someone who identifies as female. But then there are some other options, and these are kind of the ones I see the most often, although this is, again, an ever changing kind of vocabulary, and you may have different ones in your area. But there's they, them, which can be referred to a singular person. So this would be, somebody who typically doesn't identify, they don't identify as in the binary ways. They may identify as non-binary, gender queer, gender neutral, something like that. So wanting to be referred to as they, them. Z is also one, is also spelled as XE, which I've seen more now, but it's pronounced Z. So it's just replacing where you would have said she, her, or he, him, or they, them. You would use Z. There's not really a singular or plural, it's just Z. And the same thing with name. You know, some people just prefer to be called their name and don't want you to use pronouns at all. So anywhere that you would have inserted a pronoun, you just insert their name instead. Which from a, you know, kind of what we're used to standpoint, this can be a challenge. Grammatically, if you're really into the English language, transitioning to using they, them in the singular form for a singular person can be difficult. Or just using different pronouns in general. We're so used to, and it's been such a kind of cultural norm to use he, him, or she, her, that using something else feels weird and is an adjustment. So, but it can also be something that's really important to the clients that we're working with. And particularly with them feeling accepted and feeling like this is an open and welcome environment for them to be themselves and be able to talk to us as counselors about, you know, all of the pieces that they need to in order to really get the most efficacy out of counseling. We don't want to be offensive. So using the appropriate pronouns for whatever somebody wants to be called is important. But first we have to ask what they want to be called. So this is needs to be a part of our intake processes, is asking about pronouns and what do they want to be referred to as. So that's an important piece to all of this. So I've run out of time. I would love to answer questions, but I really don't have time to because I've run up against the clock. So I hope this has been helpful and informative and just given you some ideas about what to think about when you're working with somebody that may have an addiction, may also have some sexuality related concerns. And just really, if you take away one thing from this, is to add all of these elements to your intake process so that you are assessing properly for what clients might be going through and what they may not be, what they may just not come out and tell you. We often have to model what's okay to talk about. So if we ask about any sexual dysfunction or sexual concerns in our assessment process, it kind of normalizes that for our clients, tells them, communicates to them that it's okay to talk about these things. So that would be my one takeaway if you take away nothing else. So thank you so much for being here, and I appreciate everything.